My name is Ozioma Onuzulike, Director of the Institute of African Studies, University of Nigeria, Nsukka. On behalf of the Institute, I welcome you warmly to the 7th edition of our ISUNN Speaker Series. Our Speaker 7 is Dr. Kingsley Ugwuanyi, and he'll be talking to us on giving back to the giver, how Nigerian English contributes to the growth of the English language. I'll tell you briefly about Dr. Ugwuanyi, who is currently a postdoctoral research fellow at the School of Oriental and African Studies, SOAS, University of London. There he is part of the Horizon Europe funded Rise Up project, which investigates linguistic diversity across 5 European minoritized language communities. Kingsley is also a senior lecturer in the Department of English and Literary Studies at the University of Nigeria, Nsukka. By the way, Kingsley, can you stand by my side so they see who I'm talking about? So, Kingsley belongs to us, and we go now. He's a senior lecturer in our Department of English and Literary Studies. His research interests cut across the sociolinguistics of world Englishes, especially Nigerian English and other African Englishes, multilingualism, and applied linguistics. He consults for the Oxford English Dictionary, offering expertise of the inclusion of Nigerian English words as well as other West African Englishes in the dictionary. On behalf of the Institute of African Studies, University of Nigeria, Nsukka, we all welcome you on the platform. So, you have the podium. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, and good afternoon, everyone. I want to really appreciate our guy at the top, Mr. Ember Month, working together on a lot of things and come to learn about from him. So thank you so much, Prof, for this opportunity to talk about what I do, the kind of research and work. Because what's happening in Nigeria is happening in several other post-colonial contexts. Think about India, think about any post-colonial context you can think about. Similar developments taking place, just to see how we have exercised our agency to appropriate this language and make it our own, right? Make it our own. And this is what I've been studying. That's what I studied for my PhD in Newcastle. That's where I studied how Nigerians are taking ownership of the English language. Right. So if you just give me the next slide, I think that's just going to be the outline of what I will talk about today. Just give general overview of the evolution of English in Nigeria, and then look at the current status of landscape, if you like, of English in Nigeria. And then I would talk about how Nigerian English is influencing English language globally. Then I'll just put some reflections. I'll close with that. Okay. Right. Just in the first one, I was just saying here, which is something I've said already, that our first contact with English language was basically through Atlantic trade, right? So before colonialism in Nigeria, officially started in 1900, I'm right, I am. We've had that encounter with English language, even though I think our first encounter would connect to the Portuguese, which Pidgin English, which is what we're talking about, not this rule I'm talking about, but Pidgin English also came to be. If you just go to the next slide. But I think what is going to come next is just where I'm talking about. I'm saying that even though it was transatlantic trade that introduced English in Nigeria, it was the British colonialism that actually brought about widespread implantation of English in Nigeria. But today, we also know that beyond the transatlantic trade, which is no longer there, or beyond colonialism, that the forces of globalization also help to continue to maintain the widespread and the sustainability of English in Nigeria, and not just in Nigeria. So, for example, one of the forces causing English to spread across the globe today is globalization. Think about a country like Rwanda, which had no, for us Nigeria, we know that English, one of the reasons why we use English today is that we were colonized by an English-speaking country. But a country like Rwanda was not colonized by Britain or any English-speaking, but they had a relationship with France, for example, and Belgium at some point. But today, English is the official language of the country, right? Not French. It was French until 2008 or so, and they moved to English. It's not just one, but several other countries that moved to English because of globalization. Because English is perceived to be the language of globalization, language of global market in this world. And like I said, English in Nigeria has grown from being an alien or foreign language to being an own language. And I'll explain what I mean by that as we move on. Right. Now, talking about what kind of status does English have in today's Nigeria? One, of course, we say it has official status, isn't it? But then we know that this is alongside other indigenous languages in most places. For example, officially, Nigeria has 4 official languages: Hausa, Igbo, Yoruba, and English. In fact, some argue it is 5, including French, which is outrageous to mention. But something happened in 1995 and 6 when Sani Abacha was the head of state. Because of the kind of draconian law that though Nigeria was suspended from Commonwealth, and Abacha wanted to make a statement by distancing Nigeria away from the English-speaking world. So make that kind of unilateral statement that French is going to be a co-official language with English. Nothing was pursued beyond that statement. Some linguists say that because there has not been any follow-up promulgation to cancel or repeal that in theory that is still possible, but I think that was just a fluke statement. It's really anything of substance. Right. We know also English is the medium of instruction. I usually say that we know the language policy in education says that every child should be taught in the language of immediate environment. In us in Nsukka, the language of immediate environment should be Igbo, isn't it? But then we ask ourselves, how many of our children in university, primary school, and nursery school are taught in Igbo? The answer is no, right? The default language of instruction, practically across all levels of education. And then it's also the medium of cultural expression, of media, both old media, about music, about movies, and literary expression, and I will talk about this comedy as well. But again, also, the English language is in competition with Pidgin once we come to medium of cultural expression. Because when you talk about Nigerian music, Nigerian comedies, you find out that Pidgin is also quite prominent there. But English as national language, a language that expresses Nigerian identity, and you see I put a question mark there, because that is very controversial. That is quite controversial to regard English. I think what your official documents say is that there are 4 official languages that I've mentioned, but out of these 4 official languages, 3 are national languages. Hausa, Igbo, and Yoruba, isn't it? All right. But I will throw up a piece of evidence which I will use to argue that in reality, I think English should be or is the official language. The national language as well. And I'll try to establish what is different between an official language and a national language. This is the World English Studies, and this is just what was proposed by Edgar Schneider in 2003 and 2007 and 2010 to 11 and 12. He said that for a new variety of English, all right, to emerge, when we think of English, most of us think of English in one monolithic sense, that English is one language. But we know that the current development tells us that English is not one language. There are many varieties, which we call now many Englishes, so to speak. And we talk about new Englishes there. That a language, a new variety of English, practically passes through these 5 stages to be fully established. And if you could give me the next slide, please. I'll start with the foundation, then I'll go to. So, if you run everything on this page, so that, yeah, that's fine. So, at the foundation stage, and I have put what I would call some kind of tentative periodization in regard to Nigerian English, where I think Nigerian English actually was at this stage. And I say, at this stage, what is happening is that local speakers of English, remember, we're just using the case study of Nigeria. Now we had British colonizers who brought through colonialism, but also through transatlantic trade. But then they came to meet Nigerians. Most of them didn't speak English at some point, at that point. But then at this point, the local speakers see English as completely foreign, more or less like a visitor that will one day leave. If at all, they use this foreign language, and I put that foreign in quote, for some utilitarian purposes. And in this case, English was introduced through colonialism, missionary education, as well as trade. And English at this point was restricted to colonial administrators, missionaries, and a few elite Nigerians who happened to learn English at this point. And we saw evidence of this in colonial letters and reports during formal colonization. So the next slide is the exonative stabilization, where what is happening is that there is some kind of stabilization of the kind of English that the people that brought English, all right, use. What happens here, the identity of the language takes a slight shift due to wider use and acquires a second language status. Because at the point where they were, at the foundation stage, there were mostly those who spoke English as first language, for example, the colonizers. But as time progressed, right, and for us, probably around the 1920s to 1950s, I mean, these dates are all in language there's no prolongation about let us stop speaking English in this particular way, stop using it the other way. So these dates are quite controversial, I'll put it that way. But then English gained official status and was taught in schools, but they are still modeled on British English norms, the norms of British English. And then, but what is beginning to happen at this stage is the widespread second language acquisition among Nigerians. British English is still retained as the standard, but English used in civil service and schools and all of that. And one evidence of this is that in 1929 there was the Education Ordinance, which formally introduced the English medium instruction in Nigeria. So, but at this stage, what is still happening is that there is still a lot of reliance or preference for the language of the colonizers or the variety of the colonizers, so to speak. And if we could move to the next slide. Now, at this point, which is called the nativization stage, the nativization phase is where the language begins to interact more closely with the culture of the people. And one of the things that happens is that there's now a growing number of speakers of English in Nigeria, all right? And then you see that what was once considered a foreign language begins to imbibe the sociolinguistic features of the local language, giving rise to complaints of corruption, which which still survives today by corruption and being corrupt form of what people call bad English, right? When you say, oh, that's bad English, don't say it. Right. So then around post-independence Nigeria, English adapted to Nigerian realities, and we found emergence of indigenized forms and like local idioms. You see something like it has long legs. And we have semantic shifts like trek, meaning to walk a long distance, or semantic camps like I am coming, right? Which is what we all said as Nigerians. That's Nigerian English, I'm coming. Someone is speaking to you and you're going and you're saying, listen, I'm coming, right? And the position I take and the position of this talk is that it is not bad English. I don't use the word bad English at all right? It is just a different kind of English. It is just to understand it that way. Because I didn't know, I live in Newcastle, I still live in Newcastle, even though I work in London, but I never knew that there was anything that you, we are taught here in Nigeria, that the plural of you is you. And if you're talking to one person like Mr. Chidi, is you, right? If I want to talk to all of you, it's you as well, isn't it? Right? But in Newcastle English, the plural of you is use, right? It's Y-O-U-S-E. So one person is you come here, and two or more people is use come here. Alright? It's just a different kind of English. It is not bad English, only it is not in the standard variety of English. Does that make sense? Alright, now I'll talk more about lexical innovations like gist. Having a gist, I want to dash you money, someone being a co-wife and rob mine, and all that. Alright, but at this point, these emerging varieties, which is the language being nativised, being Nigerianized, being indigenized at this point, is usually criticized by those who are called language purists, as Bad English have mentioned, that if you read the next slide. Right. So at the fourth stage is what is called the normative stabilization, where there begins to appear a change in attitude towards the emerging forms of New English. There is growing recognition of the existence of a new variety of English, and the new variety is codified and accepted by the speakers. There are people today who still say that American English is bad English. Even in the UK, people still some British people still say, you want to speak good English, whatever that means, you have to speak the Queen's English, alright, even though the Queen is late now, or the King's English. So, some think that any language that is outside the standard British English is bad English, but that's not so. And that, of course, even knowing the history of English will tell us that the English language did not originate from England or from the UK. The English language is actually a West German language, it's from Germany. So the language, the same way the English language came to Nigeria at some point, was also the same way the language came to England at some point in history. Just a matter of time, all right? There was a time that English was not spoken in the US at all. Okay. I don't want to speak ahead of myself. Right. So what is happening at this stage is that there's local models of English start to gain legitimacy. Nigerian English begins to be documented. This is very important. And there's been a lot of Nigerian English being documented and defended academically at this point. And for example, the first dictionary of Nigerian English was produced by Herbert Professor University of Ibadan in 2002. There have been grammar books upon grammar books, but the example I put there is the one by Blunt and Fox in 2013. And Nigerian English was added to the old language in 2019, which I'll talk more about that as we go on. Right. Over to the last stage is called the differentiation stage. So what happens here is speakers of the local, the now emerging local variety will begin to see differences in their use of the new varieties based on factors such as regions or even social groupings, and that's very common. For example, when you hear someone who speaks Hausa, for example, as their L1 means first language. the person uses English, you will immediately know that this person's first language is mostly going to be Hausa, isn't it? There is that regional difference because the depth and the penetration of English in southern Nigeria is not as is different from how English operates in the north. And it's not just about, most of us think it's just about level of education. That may be one of the factors, but perhaps not all. Because in the north, most parts of the north, Hausa is the lingua franca, right? That's the language of the people speak. For example, the lingua franca is the language you speak with someone else who doesn't have the same first language as you. For example, if you move from here to, say, somewhere in Edo, all right, and people speak Hindi, you're likely going to speak either English to the person or speak Pidgin, right? But in the north, it's likely going to be English, likely going to be Hausa, all right, and then perhaps English and sometimes also Pidgin. All right, but we see all of these varieties, and Apple, for example, has studied ethnolectoral and as well as class-based variation. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this variation. We could go to the more practical. Nigerian English from the time of foundation to now that we're talking about differentiation. I will speak briefly about this statement. Ugwuanyi has written and said, he wrote and said, "Let no one be fooled by the fact that we may write in English, but we intend to do unheard of things with it." Right. And this is actually, and this talks about the agency of people who speak, of speakers. The point is that when any language at all is appropriated by a new language community, that language cannot remain the same because people are agentive, who do things, who use language in a way that it will reflect their identity, it will in a way that they'll be able to use that language to name things and to talk about their own realities. Right. So let's move on. Yeah. All right. Some of us might remember this, and one of the things I wanted to talk about, what I want to talk about here is remember what I was talking about the status of English in Nigeria, and I said is English a national language? I don't know if one of us that might remember this incident in 2007 when Buhari was the president. He was on a sick leave, I think, yes, in London. And it was a national holiday. I think it was Eid Fitri or so, one of the Muslim holidays, which was a public holiday in Nigeria. And he was going to speak to the entire nation, but he wasn't in the country. And he did a radio broadcast. And the radio broadcast was in Hausa. Does anybody remember that? He did that radio broadcast in Hausa instead of English. And it was highly criticized. Many people started talking about why would he speak in Hausa? All right. Is he the president of the Hausa? Is he the president of the North or president of the Nigeria? And there were some very controversial comments on Twitter. So these were some of the comments people were making on Twitter. So Tomide says, let's accept that Buhari sent a voice message. Sounds ridiculous, we have. So he did it in Hausa language. Buhari is a threat to national unity. All right. Hama says, imagine how I would have felt if Obasanjo addressed the nation in Yoruba, or Goodluck Ebele Jonathan addressed the nation in Ijaw. Whoever told Buhari to speak in Hausa is shallow. All right. So PMD, that's President Buhari, sent out Salah message in Hausa today after more than 1 month abroad. How nice. President of the North, Rankadede Baba. I mean, I don't know whether this is genuine Hausa or not because I don't speak Hausa, I don't know. But say, Wana Kai Mana Zo Kainji Dansuki Shinki Shiki Bamba. I don't know anybody who speaks Hausa can correct us. But this person, something I found interesting, said, I'm practicing my Hausa since Buhari has given us a hint about my future as a Nigerian. So what am I trying to do with this? Now, let's remember, and in fact, I was following this up when it was happening because of my interest in English. But it was so controversial that some lawyers even said that Buhari should be impeached or should do that. he has spoken in a dividing language or the regional language. But other people also said that actually Buhari did not flout any law, he did not contradict any law, because the law says that there are 4 official languages, all right, and Hausa is one. So in theory, anybody can use Hausa, Igbo, or Yoruba in official conduct. But that's the law, even though there's another clause that says that appropriate arrangements have to be made. All right? So people were arguing, did Buhari make appropriate arrangements? Because there are millions and millions of Nigerians who would not understand Hausa. All right. And then, looking at what Afolayan said here, he said it is unrealistic for anybody in Nigeria today to think that national unity can be forged in this country without recourse to the utilization of the English language. Furthermore, the fact that it is now functioning as the language of Nigerian nationalism cannot be denied. When we talk about official language, right, it's the language used for official purposes. For example, governance. All right. When we talk about national language, it's language that connects to the people's identity. All right, people's who people are. So, like the language and education policy or the constitution has told us is that while there are 4 official languages, where English is one of the official languages, then there are 3 national languages because they are considered indigenous languages and they are considered Nigerian in a sense. And the point I was making with that Buhari story is, if speaking in Hausa, someone speaking in Hausa, or speaking in Yoruba, or speaking in Igbo, or even in Job, it's not necessarily regarded Nigerian. It's regarded somewhat regional, or ethnic, or divided language. Does it not then mean that most people were saying that he should have spoken in English? All right, so that Hausa is not necessarily regarded as Nigerian, even though it's a Nigerian language, but because it is still a language that's associated with just one part of Nigeria, that what seems to be acceptable as a national language, if you see that sense of nation as something that people from across all parts of the country will understand, is likely going to be English. I've argued that this should be Nigerian English, and this is something I pursued actually very extensively in my doctoral research. And so many, I spoke to mostly Nigerian university students across the length and breadth of the country, and many people are actually saying that yes, they do think that English and Nigerian English should serve as being true, expressive of a true Nigerian identity. I'll just mention it that this is a paper published earlier this year, where actually they argue very extensively that instead of saying that Hausa, Igbo, and Yoruba are Nigerian and national language, should actually be more practicable to talk about having a Nigerian variety of English as a Nigerian national language, because that is what appears to be national, so to speak. Yeah. And this is a statement I got from Schneider. Schneider is a German professor, but he's written so much about English development across the world. And he asks these questions. He says, aren't children who grow up speaking English as their first language in, say, Singapore and Lagos, Nigeria, also native speakers of English in highly multilingual context? Even notions such as native or first language seem difficult to pin down accurately, given that many children grow up speaking several languages from early childhood, each restricted to different contexts, situations, or interlocutors. In many such countries, some speakers tend to switch to using English almost exclusively in their professional or even private lives at a certain stage, so that English becomes their primary or first language, even if it may not have been their first one acquired. And given all these developments of English, and then the point I just wanted to make with this is that in today's Nigeria, there's a growing number of Nigerian children, Nigerian youth who do not speak any Nigerian language at all. In fact, I will not be surprised if we have some of our children, some people here whose children don't speak Igbo or Hausa or any indigenous language, they speak only English. I think it has become known and become fashionable, so to speak, to raise your children speaking English. That has become fashionable, right? Even if I don't think that should be fashionable. Right, but the point is, now, when we talk about native language, we talk about first language, we talk about, for this class of Nigerians who speak only English, what do we call them? What we now say, for example, when we talk about things like native language, so which language would we say that is their native language? What is their native language? Igbo, that they do not speak, or English? Can we comfortably call them native speakers of English? And part of the things we are doing is to raise evidence from what is happening in other contexts of English outside England, outside the UK and the US, to show that there are people who can comfortably be called native speakers of English. And I'll tell you why. And I said, who then is a native speaker of English? When we hear such terms as native speaker, I wanted to raise this as a question. When we hear such terms as native speaker or mother tongue, what images do they call up in our mind? If I ask a question, and I'm actually asking this as a question, when I say, who is a native speaker of English? Or what does the term native speaker mean to you? I just need one or two responses. This is not a classroom, but we're all teachers after all. So if I just wear my teacher hat, who is a native speaker? If you hear this person is a native speaker of English, what ideas come up in your mind?
Those who speak unadulterated English, especially from the Queens in England.
Those who speak unadulterated. Let's listen. Let's be mindful of it. I'll listen to the words. The word unadulterated. Yeah.
Can I say?
Yeah, okay, please.
I think because there is no English that's bad English, we wouldn't say that Cockney, which is in London, or even the Anglo-Saxons, are native speakers. We would rather say that the English a child learns, the first language, which is English, which he learns, for that child is native English, and the person is a native speaker.
Thank you so much.
Sorry, please, let me add mine.
Yeah.
I think when I hear a native speaker, what comes to my mind as regards English language is those people from the West. When I say West, I mean Oyibo people.
That's good. Oyibo, yeah. Oyibo, very important.
Thank you. When I hear native speaker of English language, what comes to my mind is people whose language, whose English language is tied with their culture, with their in their geographical locations, like in the West, as my sister mentioned, those who grew up speaking English language, their grandfather spoke it, their great-grandfather spoke it, and it is tied to their culture, their general way of life. Those are the people I regard as native speakers of English language.
Get all the opinions, yeah?
Native speakers of English language are basically those who acquired English language as L1 from their mother. So they are the native speakers of English language. Wherever they are from, even in Nigeria here, from the West, from US, as long as you acquired English language as L1, you are seen as a native speaker of English language.
L1 means first language.
First language, yeah.
He's a doctor of English, so that not everybody here is.
I understand it to mean British. Native speaker means the British.
What about America?
They have their own brand of English.
So Americans are not native speakers of English?
I do not think so. Because, the UK, Britain colonized them as they colonized Nigeria.
Exactly.
So I see it as language of the British. Simply like that.
Good. Because even the word English is tied to England, isn't it? Any other point? Mr. Chidoke, yeah. if you say that this language is not originated from Britain, how could that one be correct? The loudspeakers.
Are you asking me or the last speaker?
I
didn't say so.
I'm talking.
All right. Now, I think there's a statement which I'll use. I think we'll still meet that statement somewhere along this slide. When I was doing my data collection in University of Lagos for my PhD, that was far back in 2018. I was speaking to this girl. She was a final year student of political science at the University of Lagos. And she grew up in Lagos, did her secondary school education, part of that in Ghana, and then returned to Nigeria. And then she spoke no Yoruba, right? The only language she spoke was English. And then I asked her, what is your native language? All right? And I was intentional to use the word native language. I use native language, I use mother tongue. And she said, my native language, my mother tongue is Yoruba. All right? I said, you don't speak Yoruba? I said, yes, I don't speak it, doesn't matter, but that's my native language. I said, why? I said, because my parents speak it, and that's the language of the community where I live. Right? Does that make sense? Maybe it does make sense. But the point I want to make with this is that, have you seen that from this room alone, we all of us do not have the same idea, the same definition of who a native speaker is, right? So, and that is very, very problematic, very, very problematic. Now, most times, that when we think about native speaker, the ideas that come to our mind, I say that something like white, which is like two people have mentioned, and I said British, which someone has mentioned. I said American, which someone has mentioned. And think about things like educated, and then there is one kind of English we have in mind, which is usually that monolingual sense of English. Right. But when we say white, we forget that there are whites who do not even speak English at all. All right? Are they included in our characterization? Maybe yes, maybe no. And you will see that these ideas are very, very prominent in things like ELT, English language teaching industry, for example. Who is hired, who is qualified to be an English teacher? And if we think of native speakers as white, for example. Now, what happens to a white child whose father is working in NMPC in Port Harcourt and was born here in Port Harcourt and grows up in Nigeria and is attending a Nigerian school? All right, is he a native speaker of English? Of which English? What happens to my son who I gave birth to in Newcastle, who grew up speaking Geordie? That's the Newcastle kind of English. Grew up speaking English. Is he a native speaker? Because he's black? Should he be a native speaker? I'm not giving answers to this. I'm just raising questions in our minds. So that Hatchell, who is regarded as the father of world English, has said that what we should do is to ban terms, and the terms he mentioned are terms like native speaker, terms like mother tongue, because of when we hear things like mother tongue, like someone mentioned that the mother tongue is the language you learn from your mother. But actually it is not, because some children, their mothers die even before they are raised, right? Some women lose their life while trying to give birth, and the child survives, isn't it? Right? So would they not have mother tongue because, of course, they didn't learn that from their mother? All right. So Kashmir is also saying that terms that prioritize proficiency and time of learning rather than geography and race. The fact that when we use such terms like native speaker or mother tongue, somebody also talked about West, which is thinking in geographical terms. You need to be somewhere to be regarded as a native speaker of English. But then we think of terms that prioritize race, right? You have to be white to be a native speaker, so to speak. But we should focus on things like a proficient speaker or user or L1 or L2 user, like first language, second language. I was talking about this, which someone said, yeah, English is my first language, but I don't think I am a native speaker of it. Someone else mentioned, even though English is my first language, I don't think I'm a native speaker of it. Now, I was looking at, this is Oxford English Dictionary's definition of native speaker. All right, it says, a person, that is a native speaker, is a person for whom a specified language is their first language. So the point here, what is very important here is first language, which someone has mentioned, or the one. So it's not just that, or the one which they normally and naturally speak. So some of us, even though we learn Igbo as our first language, have so used the English that English has become our normal language, right? Right? But then, even if we do not accept the second part, all right, we can accept that part. So for most of these young Nigerians who are growing up, right, who are speaking English as their first language, if we follow this dictionary, which is quite generic definition of native speaker, these ones are native speakers, but they are not native speakers of British English, or Jamaican English, or Indian English. They are native speakers of Nigerian English. And one of the things that will make us see is to see that English exists in varieties. Because one of the things that makes us think of people born here, Nigerians cannot be native speakers, because we think that English is one. And that one English exists in somewhere called the United Kingdom. Right. Now talking about how Nigerian English has been codified to be established as a full variety of its own. I looked at codified instruments such as the Nigerian English has been extensively described in terms of its structure, and then it has been extensively studied, and then the attitudes towards Nigerian English is growing increasingly positive, and several studies have shown this. And then also there's availability of reference materials, grammar, as well as dictionaries. Right. So I take this statement from Oxford English Dictionary when they were talking about the addition of Nigerian English words, which happened around 2020. And they said, by taking ownership of English and using it as their own medium of expression, Nigerians have made and are continuing to make a unique and distinctive contribution to the English as a global language. This is actually where I begin to go to the meat of my talk. Right, so these are the early dictionaries of Nigerian English that do exist. And then Oxford English Dictionary actually added what Oxford started doing from 2018 when I started consulting for them was to try to add more, because they have realized that English language does not begin and end in England. Is to look at what's happening with the English language across the world. So they hired a world English editor and began to consider other varieties. So this is just the announcement of it in January of 2020. Right. So then these were the words we first worked on: agric, Babin Saloon, Buka, Bukateria, chop, 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 Damfo, to eat money, Ember Month, which I think is my favorite, flag off, and then flag off to flag off, and gist, both now and verb, and Guba for gubernatorial, and Kannywood, and K-leg, and Mama Put, and next tomorrow, and non-indigenous, and Okada, and to put to bed, and qualitative, and to rub minds together, or just to rub minds, or self, which I didn't like. I don't want to tell the story of self because it was a lot of controversy before. Send forth, and severally, and Tokumbo, and zone, and zoning. And I'll just pick one or two of them. And I just wanted to pick on Ember Month, which I think I said is my favorite. I said the final 4 months of the calendar year, September to December, especially considered together as a period of heightened or intense activity. The southern Nigeria being a very religious community, I think even now most churches do Ember Month program, right? When we enter September, we need to do welcome the Ember Month, right? And so that we pray for safety, people traveling down from Lagos and all of that. The one I will tell its story is soup. All right, soup. I mean, soup is not Nigerian, but I'll tell you. I'll say this in regard to egusi soup. I'll just tell you the story of what happened when we were working on these words. To show you how Nigeria, the point I'm trying to make is how Nigeria or Nigerian English begin to shape the color of the English language globally. This is how soup is defined. I'm talking about soup, not egusi yet. This is how soup is defined in the OED. Notice it is said, usually somebody can leave it, a liquid food, all right, made by boiling meat, blah, 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 blah. And this definition is because that what the Englishman or Britishman calls soup is liquid. It's just vegetable ground. When they just grind vegetable and possibly put nothing on that, it's completely green and completely watering. So this is soup, all right? I do not know how many Nigerian soup look this way, all right? I do not know, all right? So this is what the British man calls stew. That looks a little close, all right? So when an Englishman says soup, this is what he has in mind. Or when a speaker of British English says soup, or even American English, this is the picture they have in mind. All right. So when we're working on egusi, so egusi, the definition I suggested for the Oxford is to call it soup, the kind of soup. And then we spent nearly 2 months talking about this. And they said, no, that egusi is not soup because it's not watering. All right? That it is stew because of the thickness of egusi, right? They said that we have to define it as stew. And then I said, no, that these Nigerians, no Nigerian will call egusi stew. That when we think about stew, we think about tomato, usually tomato made for rice or for yam. And then we kept going back and forth. They asked for evidence, said photos. And one of the editors said, okay, we have to, that she had to go to a Nigerian shop in London to order egusi to see how it looks, but beyond the pictures, to see how it looks, that it is not going, it doesn't look like the English soup. All right. And then she did. And then she now said, oh, I tasted it and it was fine. And then in the end, we agreed that it is a thick West African soup made with ground melon seeds, typically also containing leaf, vegetables, and meat or fish, right? Which I think is close to what we know as egusi. Right. But the point I'm trying to see here is that this now appears in the English dictionary, right? Oxford English Dictionary. So slightly moderating how soup is perceived. Not only as the watery, liquid kind of soup, but also that there's now something soup that can be thick, right? Which I consider a substantial influence of Nigerian English on the English language. Now, another area I'll talk about the influence of Nigerian English on global is Nigerian English is also getting recognition in diaspora cities, and I'll show you examples of this in Germany, in the US as well. Diaspora scholars are pushing for inclusive curricula that reflect world English, including Nigerian English. And I'll give an example from Calais to show how curriculum reform efforts to include diverse English, including Nigerian English, as well as draw evidence from Honkinam and Maya. Now, other domains of influence of Nigerian English include pop culture, things like music, the Davidos, and the, what are they? Mention them, the Thames, and I think I have a slide that shows all their names. And Nigerian movie industry with Nollywood, very popular, literary production, as well as AI. Something is really interesting is happening with AI and LLM, as well as models of usage in curriculum. So from Afrobeats, this is just from the current, from Afrobeats to Nollywood, West African cultural exports could be the next big global content thread. And we see that these, I just mentioned some of the musicians I think very popular, like Burna Boy, Whiskey, Davido, Thames, Rema, but there are many of them. And what's happening, many of them actually also sing in pidgin, right? What is happening is that we know how influential music is. So as the world is vibing, it's vibing to the music of these people, they are actually also imbibing gradually expressions that are typically Nigerian. And I was just looking at what these prominent writers have said about the English language. Adisha says, English is mine. I've taken ownership of it. And Shoyinka says, English language is a very efficient language for the purpose I want to use for it. And Achebe, again, saying, I feel that English language will be able to carry the weight of my African experience, but it will have to be a new kind of English, still in full communion with its ancestral home, but altered. And then again, that brings that notion of agency. This altering is actually making English Nigerian to suit its new African surroundings. I think the next example is the one I'll give with AI. So this was published last year. It was published in the Guardian. This is the UK Guardian. I think this is September 2024. It should be, or April. No, this is April. It's about a year ago now. It was published. What's going on here? It says, tell us, Techscape, how cheap and sourced level in Africa is shaping AI English. Because well, everybody here, I believe, knows the explosion happening in the AI world, right? Workers in Africa have been exploited first by being paid a pittance to help make chatbots, then by having their own words become AIs, plus new AI gadgets are coming for your smartphone. So I want to read this in full. I said many of us use ChatGPT, right? And we know that ChatGPT loves this word delve. Do we remember? ChatGPT loves this word there, to delve into something. And actually, evidence has shown that that is coming from Nigerian English. All right. Now just read it. This is from part of that Guardian news. It says, I said delve was overused by ChatGPT compared to the internet at large. But there is one part of the internet where delve is a much more common word, the African word. In Nigeria, delve is much more frequently used in business English than it is used in England and the US, or the US. So the workers, many of whom are Nigerians, training their systems provided examples of input and outputs that use the same language, eventually ending up with an AI system that writes slightly like an African. All right? And that's the final indignity, which is a very horrible thing to say. If AI is, that's the language of AI, sounds like African English, then African English sounds like AI is. Calling people a bot is already a schoolyard insult. Ask your kids, it's a fortnight thing. How much worse will it get when a significant chunk of humanity sounds like the AI systems that we are paid to train? So what's happening here is that most, especially ChatGPT, OpenAI, when OpenAI was trying to build their first language model, because of the cost of labor, we know when all these big corporations always go to where labor is cheap, isn't it? You could pay a Nigerian IT expert maybe $10 or maybe even $2 per hour, right? And the person will be excited to do the job and give you. So what happened at that initial stage that OpenAI was training their large language model was that they had many Africans, and especially Nigerians. So that because these ones actually speak Nigerian English, and research upon research shows that delve is very common among Nigerians. So that most of the initial trainings, many Nigerians use the word delve, all right, in the training of this language model. And that is why today you see that ChatGPT uses delve a lot. And this is one area I think also that Nigerian English is actually shaping. Most people who use ChatGPT to generate text, and if you are thinking of words, that you see in a text that suggests that word is AI generated, one of the words is delve and tapestry and what again? Dynamic interplay, right? And all those AI's expressions. But some of these may not be as frequently used in common everyday, even academic English in the Western world, but they are in places like Nigeria, and this is Nigerian English shaping what's happening within the AI world. And then also we see that People are researching Nigerian English in Germany, how Nigerians in Germany are speaking English. And I have a study on this as well, actually. I don't know why I didn't put that word here. And World English is on the word, the Nigerian diaspora in the US. Because, so English is being influential, Nigerian English is being influential, not just here. And it is sometimes ironical that some of us do not even think so much about Nigerian English, but these are scholars in the West also researching how Nigerians use English, and from a very positive standpoint, actually, than we do. All right, I'll give one more example and I'll begin to round off. So what's happening? This is happening in the Bavaria area in Germany. So the English language, of course, Germany, the official, national, and the language of instruction in most schools is German. But because of the influence of English across the world, English language is usually a compulsory subject, all right, for every child in school. So what's happening recently is that there is growing recognition that English is non-monolithic, that there are different kinds of English. So the Bavaria region in Germany actually recently, 2019 or 2018-19, did a curriculum change to say that the texts that will be used to teach English in the classroom should not just come from the UK or the US, because English is beyond the UK and the US. That the text that will be used to teach English should come from a range of countries. All right, and one of the countries that was mentioned specifically is Nigeria and India as well. All right. So I'll just read some. The curriculum innovation from above can be achieved. So an interesting case in point is the introduction of Nigeria as a country of reference for English at the advanced upper level secondary school in NRW at the beginning of 2018-19. New mandatory curriculum guidelines established Nigeria as an example topic for those students taking the advanced certificate of secondary school education that grants access to higher education. Nigeria has become part of a 2.5-year syllabus that includes rather diverse topics, among other things, the role of English language as a lingua franca in a global and digital age. And it says, interestingly, although there is no explicit information if this political decision was motivated by social development, it might be interpreted as a response to the steep rise of immigration from Nigeria into Germany. And it says, this has resulted not only in sizable communities of Nigerians in this area, but also a considerable number of children and young adults who have entered the German education system, a fact that teachers need to be prepared for. Of course, this is possible, even though this Khalid and his colleagues argue that it's not sure whether this was the reason why the government changed the policy to include Nigeria as a reference point and include texts written by Nigerian authors as part of what the children should study in school. So I just read that part that says, a similar trend to broaden the scope of the English language, English-speaking world beyond the inner circle varieties. When linguists talk about inner circle, refers to those countries where English is predominantly spoken by most people as first language, like the UK and the US. Variety and cultures can also be observed in the new curriculum for Bavaria, where one Asian and one African Anglophone country, respectively, is included as a country of reference. So, and then again, the countries that have included in the 2024 release, India and Nigeria. And these are two different regions in Germany. And what point do I want to make with this is that what is understood as English today, what is understood as English language today, does not include, even in contexts like Germany, where English is just learned as a second language, just as a school subject in school, that when policymakers, when countries think of the English language, they also have Nigeria in mind as one of the countries that actually not just study, but also shape the English language. I begin to summarize. So what are the broader implications of this development? And I said, in terms of speaker identity, which I've showed, in terms of norms of usage, in terms of linguistic rights, and I said that documenting minoritized varieties of English, not least by prestigious institutions like the OECD, talks about things like linguistic inclusion and language rights, which is right, that all languages matter, all right? All how does it say? Black lives matter, right? All languages matter as well. A great sense of pride also in the fact that the unique ways in which people use English are being acknowledged internationally. And then this aspect about recognition of languages as legitimate. And then it also helps us to reconceptualize terms such as native speaker, which I've mentioned, and mother tongue as well. And it also shows that there is expansion of not just the lexicon, but also norms of English language usage. And I think I have just 2 more questions in the next slide, and I'll be done. Right. And this is Achebe also talking, said, those who inherited the English language may not know the injustices that were and continue to be associated with it. But this legacy is ours, this legacy of injustice. And we must learn to accept it as well as to resist it for domination. Because we know that if we continue to allow this monolithic sense that English is one and that the unadulterated English, someone used that word, unadulterated English is the correct and the only correct English, it comes with real life implications. And there have been studies, especially, it may not mean so much for us in Nigeria because practically everybody speaks Nigerian English, isn't it? But when you now find that your Nigerian accent or Nigerian English in a non-Nigerian environment, it comes with real life implications. Did anybody see something that happened, I think early last year, where a Nigerian lady was calling the husband in the UK on the street and used the word drug? Did anybody follow that news? I was calling the husband on the phone, say, thing was coming from work, buy me this drug, blah, blah, blah. And another woman by the side who heard her called the police on her because she used the word drug. All right? Because for us, drug is the British man will also simply say medication. Some drug is still an English word to mean medication. Only that in England, in the UK, it has fallen out of use. Most people will just say medication. And the police came and actually arrested the lady, all right? Because they thought it had to do with the bad kind of drug, right? And in the end, it just turned out that the Nigerian lady was calling the husband to get her drugs or buy her drugs. I can't remember all the details, right? Which is medication, all right? And that is really, arresting the lady has cost her time, her prestige, or so. She was in the news all over Nigeria and the UK and all that. And there's been studies upon studies about, for example, you want to go and study a course in the Western world, in the UK, for example, in the US, and they ask you to write IELTS or write TOEFL to prove that you can learn it, that you can speak English. And you know the irony there is that if you write IELTS, after 2 years it will expire, right? And what that actually means is that after 2 years, all the English you learn in your brain has disappeared, which is not true. All right, it is good. Things are changing, right? I didn't write IELTS to go study in the UK, and many people just do go. Things are changing, but not completely, right? Because some universities will still insist that you have to prove that you can speak English. Why? Because they are also running with this idea that the only good English is their own English. But then also, the reality of the matter is that even the kind of English we hear them speak in on BBC or hear them speak, it's actually what is called the standard variety, or what we call it, for example, for Igbo, we call it Igbo, which is the standard. But we call this performance varieties because in reality, most people don't use these varieties. We want to speak centrally, but for example, when you meet someone who, if I'm from a Harvard, I speak Nsukka, right? If I see another Nsukka person, I just speak Nsukka, isn't it? Very natural. Right? But if I see someone from another part of the Igbo world, I'll now speak. So I'm using that language just to perform or just to make communication happen. But once I recline to my normally informal environment, I feel very comfortable speaking Nsukka. This is what actually happens in English as well. The standard variety of English which we hear all the time is actually performance. Once people leave BBC, they begin to speak things like use for you, right, which I've mentioned, which is filtered away from what actually penetrates to the whole world. But then these things play into, and there have been studies upon studies where somebody would call the same person would call a landlord. There are several studies of this in the US and in the UK as well, with a non-American accent, and say, I hear you advertise the house, I want to rent your house. And the person will say, I don't have a house to rent to you. They drop the call, changes the accent to sound American or British, and calls the landlord, I want to rent a house. So come over and view the house. And the only differentiating factor there is the accent. All right, so you can be denied job, denied right, denied the opportunity to rent the houses you want, just because some people think that English should be spoken in a particular way. All right, but all of these things happening actually show us that there are several ways English should be spoken, and one of those ways, and the best way, if you ask me, is Nigerian English. When I teach English. I was teaching sometime at Westminster Uni in London, and I told them that the best kind of English in the whole world is Nigerian English. The best kind of English in the UK is Newcastle English. Now, of course, Newcastle English is highly negatively perceived. All right, Newcastle people are seen as backward. Their English is not so great. And I also told them that the best speaker of English in the whole world is me. And I don't even expect you to believe that, right? So what we are doing is to show that Nigerian English matters, and that Nigerian English is actually shaping the English language all over the world. I hope I've been able to make this sense.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kingsley, for the talk. My name is Chimezi Odine. I'm calling I'm tuning in from here in Suka. I'm from the Department of Counseling and Human Development Studies. Now, I want to ask a question. You made a lot of reference to Nigerian English. Now, Nigerian English, if we go to the international academia now, can we actually come and say, okay, what I'm saying now, I'm speaking Nigerian English, I'm writing in Nigerian English. Is it widely accepted?
The truth, if you're talking about the academic world, there's a lot of gatekeeping and policing of how people should write and what people say. For example, one of the modules I teach is academic English, because academics believe that there is a way to write in the academia, right? There's a way to write, and they say all kinds of things. Don't use pronouns, don't use I, and use, some people say we and all of that, and say use third person singular and all of that. But then, coming down to your question, it depends on who you are speaking to. It depends on who is reading your work. Do Nigerians publish internationally? Yes. Do they publish internationally in Nigerian English? Yes.
I'm Edewo Nelson. I'm speaking from Abraka, Delta State University, Abraka. It's quite interesting, the theme you have brought up, which is giving back to the giver. Now, my question is this. In as much as we are providing so much to English language, which belongs to the general classification of new Englishes, how much of this, or how much work is being done to really create a national language?
If you want to artificially create such a language, which some people have attempted, it's likely going to fail. All right? So, and again, like you said, the issue of national language is very controversial. Nigeria has over 500 languages, and then you just single out 3 and say these ones are national languages. But there are millions who don't speak any of those 3. So are you going to say that even if every Nigerian can speak Hausa, Igbo, Yoruba, and English. Even if every Nigerian can speak, there are still people who do not speak Hausa, all right? There are people who still do not speak that. So, yeah, the question of that notion of exclusion is already there. And then, like you said, I do not think that artificially creating a language is going to work. But what's happening, what I really strongly propose, is to increasingly Nigerianize English. Of course, America and Australia and New Zealand have given us the platform to see that these things work. What we call American English now is now a full-fledged variety of English. And in fact, American English is also called American, just American as a language, all right? So that America intentionally also, what it did was to localize and make English become American. So that when you hear American English, when you see American English, you know that this is significantly or distinctively American. And that has given them that national identity, so to speak. What I have proposed severally, which is Nigerian English for several times, is to invest a lot in localizing and Nigerianizing and indigenizing English to make it fully and to make it acceptable.
Thank you, Dr. Kingsley, for this amazing lecture.
Thank you, ma'am.
There's this group, one of us was given scholarship to Italy for further studies. Then, one person now reminded us about the farewell mass for that person. So, one person now raised, no, it is not, he used send forth. Be reminded of the send forth. So, the other person said, no, it is not send off. It is send forth. The other person still knows. They started attacking each other. So what I did, I started mediating between them. I now said, please, I invite you people today for this lecture so that you come and hear from Doctor of English that nobody is Professor of English. So please, Doc, can you explain more on the usage of send forth and send off, please?
It's already in the OE. It's one of the words where I don't know if you saw it there when I was mentioning the words, right? The British American will say send off. The Nigerian will say send forth. And there's a reason, actually. It's not just, there's a reason why Nigerians say send forth. Do you know why? Anybody tell me why Nigerians? Growing up, I was hearing send off, growing up. But at some point, I started hearing send forth. Does anybody know why that's changed? I've heard it explained somewhere. Yeah.
Send off gives an idea of going away and never coming back, like dying and never having to relate with us again. But send forth has a picture of maybe going and coming back, or keeping open, keeping in touch with the rest of us.
So what happens is that for us as Nigerians, when we do farewell party, let me use a neutral word. When we do farewell party for people who were part of us for some reason, there are things we think about. We think about promotion. We think about continuity of relationship, which the word send off doesn't have. So what Nigerians did was to create the word, send forth is not necessarily a new creation. The word send and the word forth were already English language words, right? So, but to use that expression, send forth, to be able to include those notions that the word send off doesn't have. All right? So what do we do, like George Agbo has said, is to speak it with pride and own it. And that's what I do as myself, is to own it. And this is my identity, this is my language, and not be ashamed of it. Because if you don't market your own product, nobody will market them for you. That is the truth. So if
Dr. Kingsley Ugwuanyi contributed 25 new words into the Oxford English Dictionary. So if you are buying your Oxford English dictionary today, you are going to see his 25 words like Jagba, Abuero, 419, Gele. So it's an honor to see you again. We all started from the undergraduate days.
Yes, so faster politics.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. We will close formally and then continue the interaction. I would like to call on Professor Dr. Omema. Please, can you come over here and give us a bit of thanks before we continue the unofficial interactions? He just returned from his Humboldtian fellowship in Berlin, and so this is like also saying welcome back to your place. Now we get you. We just loaned you to them for a while. So please, can you give an official vote of thanks?
Yeah, thank you, my audience. Without you, we couldn't be here. And I'm quite glad and happy how you attend this lecture series every time it is being announced and called upon. We thank you so much. And I can't end this vote of thanks of gratitude without extending it to the director, Professor Zioma. On this note, I want to thank everybody and the director. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So special thanks to those online. We are ending the meeting now. So see you again next time, all of you that are online. We thank you, we appreciate your presence and your patience to go through it all with us. Thank you.